The Iran deal was one sentence away from being signed, according to Marco Rubio on Monday. Then Trump posted on Truth Social. He said he had spoken with the leaders of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, and Bahrain over the weekend. He said it should be mandatory that all of these countries simultaneously sign onto the Abraham Accords as part of any agreement that ends the Iran war. He said if Iran signs its agreement with him, it would be an honor to have Iran also be part of this unparalleled world coalition. He suggested Iran itself should join the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords are the normalization agreements under which Arab states recognize Israel's right to exist and establish full diplomatic relations with the Jewish state. Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of Islam, the custodian of Mecca and Medina, the most religiously significant Muslim state on the planet, does not recognize Israel, has never recognized Israel, has a firm and repeatedly stated position that it will not recognize Israel without irreversible progress toward the establishment of a Palestinian state on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state of 240 million people, the world's second most populous Muslim-majority nation, does not recognize Israel, and has a domestic political environment in which normalization with Israel is essentially impossible under current conditions. Pakistan's defense minister responded to Trump's post within hours. Pakistan is under no compulsion to adhere to any such demand, he said. There was silence on the Saturday call when Trump raised the proposal. Silence from leaders who had been called to finalize an Iran deal and found themselves being asked to simultaneously recognize Israel. According to an Axios source, Trump joked and asked if they were still there. The deal that was one sentence away just became the most ambitious regional diplomatic realignment in modern history. And every government that would need to agree to it has already said no. To understand why this matters so completely for the trajectory of the Iran negotiations and for the question of whether any deal gets signed before the military clock runs out, you need to understand what the Abraham Accords actually are, why Saudi Arabian participation specifically is the prize that has eluded every American administration for decades, what the obstacles to that participation are, and why they have hardened rather than softened since the Gaza war began, and what Trump's specific framing of this condition tells you about his strategic logic, and whether that logic produces a deal or produces the most expansive diplomatic failure in the history of American Middle East policy. Start with what the Abraham Accords were and what they changed about the regional architecture. The Abraham Accords were brokered during Trump's first term and announced in August and September 2020. Under the agreements, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan established full diplomatic and commercial relations with Israel. It was the first time Arab states had normalized with Israel since the 1994 Israel-Jordan peace treaty, and it represented a significant departure from the long-standing Arab League position that recognition of Israel could only follow the establishment of a Palestinian state. The UAE and Bahrain in particular moved rapidly toward full normalization. Embassies opened, direct flights launched, trade and investment began flowing, and the two Gulf states built genuine functional relationships with Israel that produced economic and security benefits for both sides. The Accords were a genuine achievement and a genuine break with decades of regional diplomatic convention. But the countries that joined in 2020, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, were strategically significant without being diplomatically transformative at the regional level. The UAE and Bahrain were already maintaining quiet functional relationships with Israel before the Accords formalized them. Morocco's relationship with Israel had deep historic roots. Sudan joined under specific circumstances related to its delisting from the U.S. State Sponsors of Terrorism list. The Accords expanded the formal circle of Arab-Israeli recognition. Saudi Arabia is not simply the largest Arab economy or the most powerful Gulf state. It is the custodian of Islam's two holiest sites, Mecca and Medina. It is the custodian of Islam's two holiest sites, Mecca and Medina. It is the birthplace of the Prophet Muhammad. It is the country that defines what is religiously permissible and what is not for a significant portion of the global Muslim community. Saudi normalization with Israel would not be a bilateral diplomatic event. It would be a statement about the relationship between the Islamic world and the State of Israel that carries weight far beyond any trade agreement or embassy opening. It would be MBS telling the billion-plus Muslims who look to Riyadh for religious leadership that recognizing Israel is acceptable. That statement carries consequences for Saudi Arabia's domestic legitimacy, for its regional leadership, and for its relationship with every Muslim-majority government that is not normalized with Israel. The prize is enormous precisely because the obstacle is enormous. Every American administration since the Oslo Accords has wanted Saudi-Israeli normalization. None has achieved it. The specific reason none has achieved it is the same reason that has not changed in 30 years and that has hardened significantly since October 7, 2023. Saudi Arabia will not normalize with Israel without a credible, irreversible pathway to Palestinian statehood. That is not a negotiating position. It is a red line stated publicly by the Crown Prince, confirmed by the Foreign Ministry and endorsed by Saudi public opinion that surveys show has hardened dramatically since the Gaza war began. Now understand specifically why the obstacles to Saudi normalization are harder today, in May 2026, than they were before February 28th, and why the Iran war has not improved the conditions for a Saudi-Israeli deal, even though it dramatically changed the regional balance of power. Before October 7, 2023, Saudi-Israeli normalization talks were genuinely advanced. The Biden administration had been quietly brokering a framework that involved a Saudi security guarantee from the United States, Saudi access to a civilian nuclear program with American assistance, and Israeli gestures toward Palestinian statehood that stopped short of formal recognition but established a political process. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman sat in the Oval Office with Trump in November 2025. Trump said he thought MBS would join and that there would be a solution, not necessarily a two-state solution, but something. Trump said he thought MBS would join and that there would be a solution, not necessarily a two-state solution, but something. But the Israeli government that would need to make Palestinian concessions to enable Saudi normalization is the most right-wing government in Israel's history. It has members who have publicly called for the annexation of the West Bank, and it has prosecuted the Gaza campaign with an intensity that Saudi public opinion has reacted to, with surveys showing that the proportion of Saudis who support normalization with Israel has declined sharply since 2023. And that prominent Saudi voices in media, journalism, and religious institutions have been increasingly vocal in their opposition to any deal with Israel under current conditions. The ADL, which is not an organization given to overstating Arab anti-Semitism, published an unusual statement in January 2026, expressing grave concern about the increasing frequency and volume of prominent Saudi voices, using openly anti-Semitic language and aggressively pushing anti-Abraham Accords rhetoric. That is the domestic environment MBS is operating in when Trump calls him on a Saturday. Pakistan's situation deserves specific examination because it reveals a different dimension of why Trump's demand is not a negotiating stretch goal, but an actual impossibility under current conditions. Because it reveals a different dimension of why Trump's demand is not a negotiating stretch goal, but an actual impossibility under current conditions. Pakistan is not a Gulf state. It is not geographically adjacent to Israel or to the Palestinian territories. Its relationship with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is ideological and religious rather than strategic and territorial. Pakistan has never had diplomatic relations with Israel. Its founding document, the Pakistani state's constitutional identity, is built in part on solidarity with Muslim causes globally, and the Palestinian cause has been among the most central of those for Pakistan's entire existence as a nation. Pakistani public opinion on Israel normalization is not simply opposed. It is categorically and overwhelmingly opposed in a way that crosses every political party, every religious denomination within Islam, every regional and linguistic community in the country. There is no Pakistani political leader of any party who could survive politically having agreed to normalization with Israel at the same time that Israel is prosecuting operations in Gaza. Pakistan's defense minister did not hesitate for even 24 hours before issuing his rejection. Pakistan is under no compulsion to adhere to any such demand. That is not the language of a government exploring its options. That is the language of a government that cannot afford to be seen as even considering the proposal. Pakistan is also the mediator of the Iran peace talks. The country that Trump asked to normalize with Israel on Saturday is the same country whose army chief is shuttling between Tehran and Washington trying to keep the negotiations alive. Trump's Abraham Accords demand puts Pakistan's mediation role in direct tension with a domestic political constraint that its government cannot negotiate around. Now understand what Trump's specific framing tells you about his strategic logic, and why the reading that this demand makes the deal impossible misses something important about how Trump negotiates. Trump made two statements on Monday that appear to be in direct conflict. He said negotiations are proceeding nicely. He said the Abraham Accords should be mandatory for all countries as part of the Iran deal. Those two statements are not in conflict inside Trump's negotiating framework. They are separate tracks operating simultaneously. The Iran deal, the Strait, the nuclear program, the sanctions, is the deal that Rubio says is one sentence away. The Abraham Accords expansion is a separate goal that Trump is pursuing alongside and in conjunction with the Iran deal, but not as a formal blocking condition on it. Trump himself said he would accept one or two countries not signing. He said most should be ready, willing, and able. He suggested that Iran itself might join, a statement that is either a diplomatic trial balloon of breathtaking ambition or a rhetorical flourish designed to reframe the entire negotiations as something more historic than a ceasefire framework. The strategic logic is Trump's standard deal architecture. Announce the maximum possible ambition, accept that the maximum is not achievable, and use the ambition as leverage to expand the scope of what the deal actually produces. If Saudi Arabia does not normalize with Israel as part of this deal, which it will not, but moves fractionally closer to the conditions for normalization in exchange for American support on the Palestinian state question, Trump can describe that movement as progress toward the historic ambition. If Pakistan does not normalize, which it will not, but reaffirms its mediating role and its strategic alignment with the United States in exchange for not being pressed further on Israel, the relationship is managed. The Abraham Accords demand is not a blocking condition. It is a maximalist framing that serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It positions Trump as pursuing the most ambitious possible Middle East legacy. It gives Saudi Arabia and others something to refuse, which paradoxically strengthens their position in bilateral negotiations on other issues where they need American support. And it gives Trump the ability to describe whatever deal actually gets signed as the beginning of a broader realignment, rather than simply the end of a war. But there is a scenario in which the Abraham Accords demand does become a blocking condition, and that scenario is the one that the Iran negotiations' specific architecture makes possible. The Iran deal requires Mojtaba Khamenei's sign-off. Mojtaba's sign-off requires the IRGC to not override it. The IRGC's institutional position on the deal has been resistant at every previous inflection point. The IRGC now has an additional argument for resistance that it did not have on Friday. Iran is being asked to sign a deal under a framework that Trump has publicly described as one that Iran itself might join, meaning a deal whose context includes the normalization architecture of which Iran's primary adversary in the region is the Central Party. The IRGC's hardline faction has spent 40 years building its institutional identity around opposition to Israel's existence and to any regional normalization with Israel. Trump has now publicly suggested that the Iran peace deal is the first step toward Iran eventually joining the Abraham Accords, the agreements that formalize exactly what the IRGC has defined itself in opposition to. That framing, regardless of whether it is Trump's strategic ambition or rhetorical flourish, gives the IRGC's hardline institutional command the clearest possible argument for rejecting the deal as the beginning of a regional normalization process that the Revolutionary Guard will never accept. Vahidi and the IRGC leadership do not read Trump's Truth Social posts as negotiating flexibility. They read them as statements of American intent. And the statement of American intent that the Abraham Accords expansion is the context for the Iran deal is the most useful possible argument for the institution that controls whether Iran's answer is yes or no. Here is where things stand right now. Trump announced the Abraham Accords condition on Monday. Pakistan rejected it within hours. Saudi Arabia reiterated its unchanged position, no normalization without irreversible progress toward Palestinian statehood, on the same day. Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, and Qatar have not publicly responded, but positive responses are not expected given the domestic political environment in each country. The Israeli government that would need to make the Palestinian concessions that enable Saudi normalization has not been consulted. Netanyahu's office did not respond to requests for comment on Trump's post. The IRGC has new rhetorical ammunition for opposing the deal that was previously one sentence away. The deal that Rubio described as down to disagreements over a word is now operating in a diplomatic environment that Trump has expanded from a bilateral U.S.-Iran war termination framework to a multilateral regional normalization project involving 8 countries, Israeli-Palestinian statehood, and the future of Iran's relationship with the Arab world. The deal got bigger on Monday. The ceasefire got smaller on Monday. The window is the same 72 hours it was yesterday. And the most important question is whether the sentence Rubio was trying to finish on Monday is still the sentence both sides are working on, or whether Trump's Monday post turned it into the opening paragraph of a document that nobody at the table has been authorized to write, or whether Trump's Monday post turned it into the opening paragraph of a document that nobody at the table has been authorized to write. The Abraham Accords expansion is a separate goal that Trump is pursuing alongside and in conjunction with the Iran deal, but not as a formal blocking condition on it.